Welcome to Greenlit, the Buffalo 8 podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Halderman, and each week we're going to dive into a different piece of content, film and television, and we're going to talk with some of the biggest names in front of and behind the camera as we dive deep into how they were financed, produced, developed, marketed, and the crazy stories behind how many of them got made. Welcome back to Greenlit. On today's episode, we're chatting with Andrew Freed. Andrew is the founder of Boardwalk Pictures, a company that most people will know from projects like Cheer, Chef's Table, Street Food, Last Chance U, Fearless, Goop Labs, and the list truly goes on and on. Andrew is a pioneer of how we think about the unscripted world of television today. The renaissance that we're all experiencing of premium level unscripted TV didn't really exist before Andrew Freed and his team at Boardwalk pioneered it with Chef's Table. On today's episode, we dive into a number of projects, framed primarily around Chef's Table, but also talking about things like Jiro Dreams of Sushi and how that was foundational to the founding of the company, all the way to working with Gwyneth Paltrow on Goop Labs, and then the explosiveness of the show Cheer and how that once again changed the direction for the company. Andrew's a really grounded guy we've gotten to know over the last several years. We've been fortunate enough at Bondit to work with them on the financing side of the business from a top-down level. So we've got to see underneath the hood of a number of their projects and operations over the last several years. Their growth is impressive, and their tenacity for really amazing original storytelling is something we haven't really seen from that many companies. Without further ado, enjoy this conversation with Andrew Freed on Chef's Table. Welcome back to Greenlit. On today's episode, I'm chatting with Andrew Freed. So first off, Andrew, thanks for taking some time this morning to talk.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
So I've been fortunate enough to know Andrew now for a few years, and really prolific unscripted producer, director, writer, executive, and founder of a company called Boardwalk Pictures, producing projects like Chef's Table and Cheer and Goop Labs, Last Chance U, and the list certainly goes on and on. But I want to start the conversation talking about Chef's Table, which I think is something everyone really thinks about when they think about really the renaissance of this unscripted television and unscripted film movement we're going through, and how you guys have been big pioneers in that. So without further ado, Chef's Table and the story on how it was greenlit.
Thank you, Matthew. It's very cool to be here and talking about it. You know, it's funny. I think there are probably, like any relatively historic moment, that not that I'm, calling the greenlighting of Chef's Table historic necessarily, but it's historic for me, and it's historic for our company, and it's historic for anyone that had anything to do with it, because it really was a turning point and a launching pad for us to kind of do what we envisioned doing in this space without ever having previously had the permission to do that. To go back a little bit before when Chef's Table was actually greenlit, I started Boardwalk Pictures in 2010. Before that, I had worked at a company called Radical Media in New York, primarily. Really, I guess that was the only place I had worked. I produced a show for them called Iconoclasts that I started as an associate producer, came up as a story producer, and then ultimately was one of the several producers on that show. I worked for Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky on that show, who were very much documentary filmmakers, documentary with a capital D, like in the purest way, in a way that really, Joe and Bruce have kicked in the door on so much of what today we take for granted as these true crime stories. Bruce has now passed away, but Joe and Bruce were doing that, when you and I were in elementary school, I think. And so they really, I'll take that opportunity to make Joe sound old. I hope he hears this. But working for them on Iconoclasts, which was this show that I think some people are aware of. I think many people are aware of it as a title. But if you had to really quiz people on how many have seen that show, we'll never know. Sundance Channel didn't subscribe to Nielsen ratings at the time. It was paid for by Grey Goose, so it was this sort of branded entertainment experiment, a very successful one at that. But Condé Nast was a partner in that before Condé Nast fully had a production arm, and so there was a lot about that looking at that show is actually pivotal and very much an inflection point as a case study of where we've ended up. But all to say that my experience as a producer was primarily in programming like that. I had come up under Joe and Bruce, and so much of what I learned from Joe in particular, and from John Kamen, who owned Radical, was this idea of authenticity, the idea of all of these principles in unscripted storytelling that probably were left of center. But it was my experience and it was my exposure. And so it became my foundation in many ways. So when I started Boardwalk Pictures and I moved out to Los Angeles, it was this idea that I wanted to start a company that was around premium unscripted storytelling. I very much took a survey of the marketplace at the time. And I remember, now I'm going back to 2010, this was the boom of reality television, right? This was, as I recall, and I might get some of the dates wrong, but this was Honey Boo Boo, this was John and Kate Plus 8, this was the Kardashians, Duck Dynasty, just everything that defines that moment in television. And I knew that what I knew how to do, never mind what I was interested in doing, never mind what I was interested in watching as a viewer, but what I had experience doing was something far different from that. At some point in my career, not right around then, but at some point in my career, I ran a show for Bravo, a reality show for Bravo, and I was lousy at it. And not because I was better than it in any way, quite the opposite. I did not have the chops to do what those folks do.
What was the show, Andrew?
Producers. The show was called Courtney Loves Dallas, which is not about Courtney Love. It was about Courtney Kerr, who. So it's a perfect example, right? I can't believe I'm going to talk about Courtney Loves Dallas on this podcast. It's worthy of a digression. Courtney had been on a Bravo reality show called Most Eligible Dallas, which they were not bringing back. It was about singles living in Dallas. They were not bringing that back, but she had popped as one of the ensemble members. She had sort of popped. She started this blog when Most Eligible Dallas was on in 2011, 2012, whatever it was. She started this blog called What Courtney Wore, which was just people who were watching. Wow, I'm going to get you to pull all these clips. Courtney Kerr is going to be very happy with me. She had this blog called What Courtney Wore that kind of caught on. People were interested in what she was wearing. And this was before you could really link it. And it was before the blog business. Mm-hmm. She was really one of those pioneers. She was on this show. She started this blog. People were following her. And she quit her job as a regional manager at the Sunglass Hut to become a full-time fashion blogger. And Bravo was going to do a spinoff of Most Eligible Dallas about Courtney Kerr. I came on to run it. As I said, was pretty lousy. I ran it with producer Lauren Weinstein, who had far more experience in a more reality realm. She was quite good at what she did. I was trying to do something that was not the assignment, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But my filter, my lens, my experience, having worked under Joe and Bruce a little bit, having done what I had done with my colleagues and peers at Radical Media, I thought it was so interesting to see this woman who is taking a huge risk. She's a 30-year-old single woman in Dallas, Texas. She's just quit her job. She's on her own. To put a very honest, unfiltered lens on her and observe that would have been so interesting. And by the way, looking back on it now, it was so interesting. She was the first, she was a pioneer. She was the first person I ever knew of. Like, we used to have so many meetings and calls with Bravo, and they would say, so what does she actually do? And I remember just saying, it's very hard to explain what she does. She takes pictures of herself wearing stuff and links it to things, and then companies send her more stuff to wear. And that's kind of like, it was so foreign at the time and so normal now, so standard now. But
yeah.
all to say that, like, my version of that was a version that now we can reference a show like Cheer, we could reference a show like Last Chance U, we could reference a show like Action, we could reference a lot of the shows that we've done and say, I would have loved to have done that version. But the reality is that that version didn't really exist as an option at that time. When I used to sit with agents and say, I want to do premium unscripted, again, similar to the blog conversation, they would sort of look at me cross-eyed and say, I don't know what that means. And I would identify, again, back to my spectrum. So on one side of the spectrum here is the Honey Boo Boos and John and K+8 and Duck Dynasties and whatnot. And then on the far other end of the spectrum was documentary film. Ken Burns, Errol Morris, Joe and Bruce, the Maisels, just a host of filmmakers that honestly I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of, because neither of those two things were really where my interest as a viewer or as a storyteller lied. Like, I wasn't the guy to watch hours and hours and hours of scratchy footage in like a journalistic kind of way. I love Errol Morris films, and there are lots of documentary films that I quite love, but I was not the guy who had, studied documentary in film school. But I also wasn't really wanting to watch John and K+8 or the Kardashians. And so what I identified, though, based on my experience working on Iconoclasts and based on my interest as a storyteller and as a viewer, was there's got to be something in the middle, and not even really right in the middle, but probably closer towards the documentary side of the spectrum, which is we're craving something authentic. That's why we're watching these reality shows on Bravo and E. We're craving authenticity. We're craving something real. We're craving to connect to something that real people are actually experiencing. But we want it to be authentic, truly authentic. The more authentic, the better. The less filtered, the less staged, the less contrived it is, at least for me, the more interesting it became. So back to Courtney, the Bravo show that we made was perfectly fine. And I don't want to say that I'm particularly proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it in any way. Like, we did the show. I did my 16-week contract. I remember we were not done after 16 weeks. And I was like, well, I can still, I still have ownership of the show, and I'll still come in and look at cuts. And there was this sort of silence on the phone. And I said, unless you feel like you got it from here. And they're like, yeah, we're good. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that cue. But I was craving to do something more authentic. I was craving to do something far more true and real and less contrived and all of those things that we're saying. But I wanted it to be entertainment. I wanted it to be entertainment first. Yes, I wanted it to be inspirational. Yes, I wanted it to leave the world better than it found, the world before the show was made. I had all these intentions, moral intentions and spiritual intentions and all of these things for the stories that we wanted to tell, that were important to me. And I really believed that all of that can happen in a way that would be far more broad in its appeal, far more for the masses, far more eyeballs to attract to these things. And so, I started using this term that I'm not proud of, but it was real for me at the time, which was there's no docu-tainment. We're not reality shows, and we're not documentary film. We want to be docu-tainment.
Thank God you didn't name the company that.
Could you imagine? Oh my gosh. But like, I think the ethos of that still holds true.
Definitely.
We ask ourselves a lot of questions when we're evaluating new projects. On one side of the scale, we ask ourselves the question, I have this thing called the 8th grade assembly test, or the 8th grade test, which is, when we're done with this show, will it be worthy of taking the entire 8th grade, putting them into the auditorium, making them watch 1 or 2 episodes, and then talking about it for an hour? Because if it's not worthy of that, then is it worthy of the 1.5 years of our lives that we're going to spend making it, even if it's a colossal failure? Even if we don't get a season 2 and nobody watches the thing, it's still going to be like 1.5 years to 2 years of our lives working on this. And so if it's not worthy of getting a bunch of 13 and 14-year-olds about it for an hour, then it's probably not worthy of our time. And one of the other filters of, is this worthy of our time, is like, is it entertainment? Is it going to provide some sort of escape, some sort of release, some sort of joy, like actual joy in watching it? And that doesn't mean that you can't do hard things. It doesn't mean that there aren't hard topics that we try to take on and conversations that we try to start with the stories that we tell. But is it entertainment? Is there entertainment value to this, or is it just medicine? Because that's not really what we do either. So we had been toiling away in that echo chamber of a conversation, really with ourselves, because at the time, like, nobody much cared. I had a great relationship. I continue to, but Michael Bloom, who I think you may know Michael, or we can edit that out if you don't. But Michael Bloom was the head of originals, or head of unscripted originals. I don't remember his exact title, but he was basically a big part of the launch of Fox Sports 1. If you remember back, now I'm fast forwarding a couple of years, but into like 2012, 2013, ESPN 30 for 30s were all the rage.
Amazing. And that was a massive fan.
And it was me too. And it was a massive thing for our business and ultimately for my personal trajectory. If there's no 30 for 30, I don't think there's a chef's table. Honestly, I don't think there's any of the stuff that we ended up doing at Netflix those first few years and continue to do. 30 for 30 was big. It was loud. It was authentic. It was documentary for the masses. People were loving it. People wanted more of it. So 30 for 30 had been very successful at ESPN. When Fox Sports 1 launched, the conversations that I had with Michael Bloom, and I don't think we ever said this explicitly, but I think what my assumption always was that, okay, ESPN is doing this with the one-offs. The new Fox Sports 1 that's going to launch, next year or whenever it was, can do it in series. So instead of doing one-off features, let's do documentary series that still maintain that sort of authenticity and curated documentary voice. So we did 4 projects for Fox Sports 1 in their first couple of years. We did Being Mike Tyson, which was a partnership with Asylum. We did the Pecos League, which was a partnership with 44 Blue. We did Back of the Shop, which was a partnership with Then Relativity. And we did Road to the Show, which was a show that we did ultimately on our own. But those shows became the first things that Boardwalk really was taking ownership of holistically. Yes, we have those partners, and I name them because they're important. And I would really not be thrilled if I were, you can edit all that out. I name them because they were important partners on the project. But we started to take real ownership of how we would make these shows. There was an inflection point at one point early on in the show Being Mike Tyson that we did, where we were going a little too far or some people thought we were going a little too far in that documentary direction. A comment was made, this is not the Sundance Film Festival. This is a reality show. And I remember saying, I'm not making a reality show. Like, somebody once said when we were doing being Mike Tyson, they said, we really want to humanize Mike. And I said, why would you want to humanize him? He's larger than life. I don't want to bring him down. I don't want to see him driving carpool and like arguing with his wife whether or not she should get Botox. Like I want to be with one of the like luminaries of sport of our generation and understand him in a way that maybe we haven't understood him, in an intimate and provocative and honest and unfiltered way. But I don't want to be packing up lunch and kissing the kids before they go off to school. Like, maybe that's a worthy project, but that's not what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And so Bloom, to his credit, really stood up at that inflection point. I had like 15 minutes of a first cut that was very controversial, and Bloom saw it and he said, keep doing that. You're getting it right. And that gave us permission to do that. Anyway, very proud of those shows. And it started to be our voice creatively, how we do things. Certainly on like that sports doc kind of side. Because this is about the Greenlight, I will get into the real granular details of this stuff. When we were making Back of the Shop, which was a talk show that took place in a barbershop in the Bronx, far before LeBron James had the notion of doing a talk show in a barbershop. It's actually a good show. I don't know where these Fox Sports 1 shows are available, like if they're on iTunes or if FS1 has an app now. I don't know, but they're good shows. I'm really proud of them. And Back of the Shop was one of those. Matt Weaver was one of the executive producers of Back of the Shop. Matt became a friend at the time, and he was in the Bronx for one of our shoots. And I remember standing outside the barbershop with him, and he said, I got to introduce you to this guy. I'll never forget, he called him Dave Gelb. I don't think I've ever heard him called Dave again. And I don't even think Matt would call him Dave. But for some reason in my head, he said, I got to introduce you to Dave Gelb. And I said, okay. And he said he directed this documentary called Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And I think you guys would really get along. So when I came back to LA, I had a meeting with David in December of 2013, I guess. In December of 2013. I had seen Jiro Dreams of Sushi. I thought it was great. I'm a sucker for father-son stories. I'm a sucker for a lot of that stuff. I thought it looked beautiful. I remember I used to have this discussion. I don't even want to call it a debate, but this discussion with Joe Berlinger where sometimes he would say that, if something looks too pretty, the audience won't think it's real. Speaking about like documentary and how document. Now, to defend his position, on the other side of things, we used to laugh at the sort of like NYPD Blue, camera coverage of things. Like, why would you try to shake the camera to make it look real? Like when we're shooting documentaries, we do everything to try to not shake the camera. So the idea of somebody shaking the camera, felt counterintuitive to us. But he did say from time to time, I don't even remember really which project it was, but he said, if it looks too pretty, it doesn't feel real. And that became a little thing for me. Like, it's funny how these minor conversations, I probably talked about that with Joe once or twice at 1:00 in the morning in an edit room, or outside the edit room. We used to always have cereal late at night in the edit. So, it was probably over a bowl of cereal at like 1:00 in the morning. But that stuck with me. And I remember when I saw Jiro Dreams of Sushi, the idea of like, wow, this is so beautiful and it's so real. And it can be both of those things. And I really admired that. So I sat with David. I believe at the time, and again, this is where there are probably 16 different versions of how this started for all the different people involved, but this is my version and this is how I remember it. I think it's pretty accurate. At the time, I believe David had some conversations preliminary with Netflix about Jiro Dreams of Sushi, about what that could maybe live like, or what that could what he might want to do potentially in the episodic television space. But when I sat with David, we just sort of talked. It was not, I have this project and I'm looking to partner with somebody. It was just a conversation about stuff we've made, people we've made things with, our views on how you would make things, and just being storytellers and, being from New York and just, chewing the fat a little bit. And I remember saying to him during that conversation, have you ever, because I'm a TV producer, like that's how I enter the world. And so I'm always trying to imagine what the TV version of something is. And so I said, have you ever thought about doing television? He says, yeah, whenever I talk about TV, people always ask me like who the host would be and what the format would be. And I said, well, if there were no lame people and no lame questions, what would you want to do? He looked at me and he said, I'd want to do Planet Earth for food. I could run with that. Now, ultimately, I don't think that's really what Chef's Table is. It certainly evolved from that initial log line. But Planet Earth for food, that was something I could go with. And I did. And I remember immediately thinking, there's something here. We sat with Netflix soon thereafter. Adam Del Deo had only been at Netflix, I think maybe like 6 or 8 weeks. We went to their offices in Beverly Hills then. We met with Lisa Nishimura, who, now is this luminary household name for many people in our business. She was just a smart, person who wanted to tell cool stories. Adam, was a smart person who wanted to tell cool stories. We sat and talked about what we thought Chef's Table, it was called Chef's Story at the time. We couldn't clear title clearance. So we had to change the name sort of at the last minute, like minutes before the announcement at a Toronto Film Festival, but we'll get there. We talked about what Chef's Story could be and would be. Brian McGinn, who was one of David's sort of cohorts and just really the hero of Chef's Table, I believe, and certainly one of them, great storyteller, really talented guy. He had laid out who these first 6 chefs would be. I say he and David, but he really took the lead as far as I perceived it at the time of like who these first 6 chefs would be. We took this deck into Adam and Lisa. We talked about the show a little bit. It was not a traditional pitch. I remember them saying, David did Jiro and you've done Iconoclasts and you've produced a whole lot of other stuff and the Fox Sports 1 stuff and everything. And like, yeah, this makes sense. Let's do it. Now, let's go back in time, right? Netflix, to me, was the DVDs in red envelopes that I had, sitting on top of the TV, the big TV that was a box when you could like sit things on top of it. But yeah, it was reruns of Californication and on DVDs in a red envelope to me. And so House of Cards did exist and I guess did stream, but I was not tech sophisticated enough to be streaming shows at that point. And that was it. That was all Netflix was. I'm sure Orange is the New Black was in production. I'm sure Arrested Development was probably about to come out. They hadn't done anything on the unscripted side. And so we were their first unscripted show. There was no in-house production at Netflix at the time. And so we had a bond company that had to participate in that first season. And I had no experience with that whatsoever. Dane Lilligard, who's now our EVP and head of production and operations, he had experience in the independent film world. And so thank God he knew how to navigate that terrain. Otherwise, Chef's Table would have never happened. But that's the very long, I apologize, but that's really sort of how that thing started. And then it was a matter of, I remember we got the budget, which was perfectly healthy at the time, from Netflix. I remember calling Dave, or having a meeting with David and saying they ordered 6 of these, and here's the schedule, and here's the budget, and everything else. And this sort of color washed from his face. And he said, it took me like 2 years to make Jiro Dreams of Sushi. We shot for a while, weeks, if not months, and then came back and edited, and then went back and shot more. And again, that's my memory of it. David might say, what are you talking about? We never went back to shoot pickups. But like in my head, it was, we shot this thing for like months, and then we edited for like a year, and then we went back and shot more. And there's no way we can do this 6 times, with 9 shooting days and 8 edit weeks. There's no way. And I said, there is. And I know how to get us there. And we're going to work with story producers. We're going to work with story producers. And I have editors who are, not necessarily film editors who will expect to work on something for a year, but they can understand that aesthetic and can grind these out. And then we started talking about, so that was the post conversation. And then we started talking about how to capture it in the field. And David and Brian and our 2 DPs from season 1 who really invented the look of that show, Adam Bricker and Will Basanta, said, we're not going to take any zoom lenses with us. We're going to shoot on the red, which I was like scared of. The red, there's no, the red, I don't know. And we're going to shoot on primes. And I remember thinking like, no, that's not how you make a TV show, guys. And they convinced me. And it was hard. And even the episode that I directed that first season that Adam Bricker was the DP of, like, it was hard. And I love Adam. And I just spoke to Adam yesterday about a new project. Like, I love making stuff with Adam. But initially, it was hard. How do you shoot verite on primes? Well, this isn't a verite show. Well, then how, like, just all of these questions of really finding our footing and figuring out what that show was, and how to make it. And we always, when I started the company, I used to, preach certain things to anybody who would listen, which at the time meant very few people. But I would say, quality will never go out of style, and the pendulum will swing in our direction. If it's Honey Boo Boo and the Kardashians now, the pendulum will swing always towards quality at some point. I never could have imagined that I would and we would play a real significant role in that pendulum swinging. When Chef's Table came out, it was a big deal, and it was the early stages of Netflix. And as I recall, Chef's Table came out in April, and then Making a Murderer came out that December, which we had nothing to do with, but Making a Murderer was a moment. It was that like Christmas break, and everybody was home, and in those 2 weeks, sort of everybody in the world watched Making a Murderer. It was the first time I remember hearing binge watching. And we came back from that holiday break. I remember coming back in January and feeling like Netflix was a thing, and it was a different thing than maybe we had realized it was going to be. And that was when we had our conversations with Adam and Lisa about doing more Chef's Table episodes. And ultimately, they greenlit 16 more episodes in March. So, we started the conversation in January. We started doing some chef selections. But by March, I believe, they had greenlit 16 more episodes of Chef's Table. And the world for me and the world for us. And I do think, without being too grand, like, the world for premium unscripted storytelling was changed.
For sure. How many seasons did that 16 episodes encompass? Was it 2 seasons?
It was more than that. So then the releases were always 6. Now the world has changed a little bit, and they do, certainly for Chef's Table, we do 4 episode releases, but it was season 2, it was season 3, and then it was the France episodes that we did 4 of.
Great.
So, season 2, season 3 in France, all happening on one phone call.
It's pretty exciting.
Big deal.
It's pretty exciting.
Really, really, really exciting.
Before we move off of Chef's Table, because I want to come back to it, But I want to ask kind of a self-serving, selfish question, which is, you've traveled all over the world, and I think people can probably hear and see how genuinely curious you are. And I think that comes through in the way you guys as a company tell stories, which is, you call it authenticity and realness. And that is very clear, even knowing you the way I know you and thinking about the content you've made. Of all the places you've gone, now with not only Chef's Table, but things like street food, what's been the most exciting place? And maybe that's not been the most exciting piece of content out of it, or maybe it has because of that. But you've gone all over the world. And I'm always fascinated by people that are curious and sort of pull the thread of world travel and world culture, what they come back with that has changed them and changes the way they think about their world and the world at large.
It's a great question. I am curious, but I also am like very comfortable in my patterns, in my habits, and in my safety zones. So prior to making Chef's Table, and by the way, I wish I have gone to every place where Chef's Table shot. I'm not at every location, but it's been cool. I don't want to pretend like I haven't gotten to travel the world on that and some of these other shows that we've made. So, but as an individual, I, like my friends who have known me a long time, like Chef's Table is actually not a very natural pairing for me. Number one, my culinary palate prior to making Chef's Table was that of my 6-year-old. No, I would say my 6-year-old eats better than I did when I started Chef's Table. I just, again, like, I get very caught up in my habits and things that keep me comfortable, and that's just sort of how I had lived. So it became very clear to me early on that might be like a cute thing to say. Let me take that back. It became very clear to me early on in producing, but specifically directing Chef's Table episodes, that wasn't an acceptable sort of way to be. Meaning, I can't joke with the chef about the fact that really what I wish I was eating was McDonald's around the corner, because I'm the person who's telling their story. And of the directors, so that first season, and then for a while before Abby Fuller was added to the mix for season 2, I believe. But that first season, it was David, Brian, Clay Jeter, and myself who directed the 6 episodes. And I remember thinking, like, it's not fair for the chef if they get stuck with me, because Clay is so interested and curious about everything, including food. And Brian is he would never want me to use the word foodie, but like, he's such a student and an appreciator of food and the culinary experience, as is David. I mean, they both, they're in their happy place when they were making a Chef's Table episode. For me, it was pushing myself. And so the sort of emotional places that I went of just having to push my own boundaries to experience the food and everything else, that is probably the most profound change that happened for me. But then every trip that I took was pushing boundaries in a way that I never could have imagined. So those first few seasons, I stayed close to home. Season 1, I had 1 baby. Season 2, I had 2 babies. I directed Miki Nakayama, which was in Los Angeles. And then I directed Dominique Crenn, which was in San Francisco. And then I directed Nancy Silverton, who was in Los Angeles. Like, I really was staying close to home. But then there's a producer who we work with on many of the episodes, not all of them, but many of them, Michael Hilliard, who's just one of the most talented producers in the world, quite literally. He's based in Australia. I used to work with him in New York. We brought him on to produce some of the episodes, season 1 and subsequently. And he's just a true, wonderful partner of mine. He's a great friend, and he's been a great partner to Boardwalk and to so many of our shows. I think that if you asked him, he probably had an ulterior motive as my friend and as someone who had known me for a while, to always be like pushing opportunities. So I'm in San Francisco doing the Dominique Crenn episode, and then all of a sudden the idea that maybe we should be shooting in France, in her hometown in France, came up, and it's like, yeah, we totally should do that. And I'm shooting with Nancy Silverton in Los Angeles, and the notion comes up of maybe we should be shooting at her house in Pamukkale, Italy, because it sounds like that's really important to her. Okay, yeah, that seems like a good idea. And then when we did the France episodes, and Michael produced all 4 of those France episodes, the chef that I directed was Adeline Guittard in Paris, who's awesome. And the first interview we did with her, she started talking about she had worked in this restaurant in Hong Kong, and that really informed her cuisine. And what she's doing is like a French version of this like Asian fusion. And Hilliard looks, I remember it was like 2:00 in the morning. He looks at me and he goes, I guess we're going to Hong Kong. and we did. And so all of those trips really pushed me in ways and opened my eyes to the world in a way that I never even thought I needed. Like, I'll say this, when people come back from India, I've noticed you say like, oh, how was India? And they'll say like, it's not for everyone. Mm-hmm. They're talking about me. It is not for me. Like, I don't know if I'm ever going to go to India. We certainly have produced a lot of things in India that I'm very proud of, and it's beautiful to me, and the shows are beautiful, but like, I don't know what I would eat. I don't know where I would sleep. I just can't imagine myself being comfortable in India for some reason. Love the people, love the culture, love the art, love the music, love so much about it, love to see it on my screen. Not sure how comfortable I would be there. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's about being a little bit uncomfortable. But I just never imagined that I would have these tactile, on-the-ground experiences in these places around the world. I filmed a show called Fearless about Brazilian bull riding. We filmed at a rodeo in Brazil called Barretos. That was a 7-hour drive from Sao Paulo. 150,000 people camp out overnight during the week of this rodeo. I never imagined that anything like that would be a part of my life. The places that we filmed in Thailand for the Bolan episode of Chef's Table that I directed, we had like the Bangkok portion of that shoot. And then we went out into the islands, of Thailand, and had these amazing experiences that I never thought I would expose myself to. So I'm giving the lame answer, which is to say all of the above, but I am genuinely feeling that as I'm reflecting on your question, which I think is a good one.
No, I appreciate it. I would say I want to jump to something else, but I want to end this part of the conversation by saying you've got to go to India, dude. If you're doing Thailand and Brazil, India is I spent a fair amount of time in Hyderabad and also in Mumbai, and you've got to do it. It's especially if you've done so many of those other places that are equally as non-Western.
Someday. We've done, again, we've and we continue to make content that we're so proud of, that we've filmed in India, and stories and characters that we've met in India. And it's such a big part of just the world, obviously, just there are so many stories to be told and so many people and such an audience to connect with there. I mean, it's our objective, especially working with partners like Netflix. Like, how do we reach that audience? And so I'm just a little intimidated by it, to be honest.
No, I can appreciate that. I can get it. I want to go to.
You've spent time in India. Wouldn't you say like, yeah, maybe it's not for everyone?
Oh, I mean, it's not for most people, I think. I mean, it's especially. I mean, there are cities there. There are 40 million people in the cities, more 50, 60, 70, 100 million people in cities. It's a lot. I mean, the best description I ever heard about India is it's an overload of the senses in every way, in every sense, no matter whether you're in the countryside where you're not in the dense population, or you're in the country, or you're in the middle of a city and there's no street laws at all. There's literally no law to how the traffic actually operates. And there's 40 million people at rush hour trying to go across the city. We think traffic in LA is bad. It can take 2 hours to go 5 miles in Mumbai. It's insane. So I hear you, but I think what's awesome, before I segue, I think what's awesome about you setting out with the goal of, I know I'm going back to a phrase you didn't want to say, but the docu-tainment idea, and then making it global, which is so cool, right? I'm going to go back to a phrase you said that you didn't want me to use, which was docu-tainment, and this idea that with the goal you guys set out to initially build the thesis of Boardwalk around, you achieved that and then so much more. And so using your story about, well, India may not be for everyone, I think a lot of the restaurants and the chefs and the places that those restaurants and chefs exist in may have seemed intimidating or overwhelming or inaccessible to a large part of the population. But because the show became such a big thing, it became accessible and interesting and possible for so many people in a way that I remember you once described Chef's Table to me, and you said it here, which is planet Earth for food. But you once described it to me as, I think, Beethoven or Chopin or Stravinsky over top of slow motion pasta. And that idea of like very, very highbrow and very, very middle of the road, you were able to meld it perfectly. And so this is kind of a nice way to segue into Cheer and Goop as sort of the newer projects today, right now. And I'm curious, Andrew, how different making those shows was in 2017, 18, 19 versus making the first unscripted projects with Netflix, how different the world is, how different Netflix is in the world, and how different unscripted content is seen in the world since then. And like you said, you guys being a big pioneer in that, and I know the business has changed a lot since Chef's Table season 1.
Sure. No, it has changed a lot. And again, I think we've hopefully been on the front edge of that as it continues to change. You know, it doesn't change once. It's constantly changing. One of the things that I'm proudest of about Chef's Table is that, similarly to how I'm talking about personally, how it helped me, sort of push boundaries, I think it did that for viewers a little bit, right? Which is to say, you can, because it's an anthology, you can cherry pick. Mm-hmm. And you could cherry pick now, right? Somebody's listening to this and has never, heard of Chef's Table and has certainly never watched a Chef's Table episode. There are, depending on when this releases, there are 40, 42. I'm embarrassed to say I've lost count. But there are over 35 episodes of Chef's Table out there.
For that, you can be certain.
Yeah. I can't believe if you would have told me that I would get to a point where I wouldn't even know the episode count off the top of my head. But it's really crazy. Again, to entrepreneurs, to people who are at the beginning of something. I love sort of that idea of being at the beginning of something. The idea that this show that really changed the world for me, and is something I'm so proud of, and I can't really, unless I sat down and did the math by seasons, I don't know the number of episodes off the top of my head. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, so you're a viewer, you're going to pick up Chef's Table for the first time. Maybe start with a pastry episode, because you're not, maybe you have my culinary palate and you really don't want to get into all the fancy foraging and everything else. So maybe you start with Christina Tosi, the founder of Milk Bar. And because she makes cookies and cakes, right? Like what's scary about cookies and cakes? And you watch, and it's in English, right? For an English speaking audience, like there's no subtitles. She's she's not one of these intimidating chefs. She's very approachable. Her food is very approachable. Her personality is very approachable. The style in which I think we made that episode is intentionally very approachable, to mirror her. And you watch that and you love it. Oh my God, it's the best thing I ever saw. What's the next one I'm going to watch? Well, maybe you go into Dominique Crenn. I'll just reference the ones I directed because I really love those. Maybe you go to Dominique Crenn because for whatever reason you've been to San Francisco and maybe you hated her restaurant or you heard of her restaurant or she's just an amazing woman and worthy of learning about her for an hour. And she talks with a little bit of a French accent. She gets a little bit more artistic in her intention and the way that she presents her food. The food is not certainly not cookies and cakes. It's definitely far more of a gastronomic, elevated experience. And then when we go to France, to her hometown in Brittany, now we're talking French. Now there's subtitles. And by the way, as you're going through that show, like there's some real emotional stuff. Not that there's not emotional stuff in Toasty's episode, but so now you've watched a show about food, but maybe you've cried or had some sort of an emotional connection. You've read some subtitles. You've seen what a deconstructed salad looks like on a plate that's made out of a tree that was cut in the woods, and now you've pushed yourself. Now where do you go next? Maybe you go to Francis Molman. Maybe you go to Adeline Guittard. Maybe you go to any number of these chefs, Massimo Bottura. Maybe you go to Favakin, the seasonal restaurant that Brian profiled in season 1. You don't go to Favakin because it's now closed, but you can go to that episode. But all to say that we bring you in, and then when you turn around, you realize, wow, I've been watching a show about modern gastronomy that has subtitles, and how did this happen? I was just trying to watch Christina Tosi about cookies and cakes. Right. And so that's been my experience in making that show. Honestly, that's been my personal experience, and I hope that that's the experience for people who are watching it. And so to your question of how that then, or how do you go about making Cheer? I think Cheer and the Goop Lab are two very different shows, but we're borrowing, I think, from things that have been done before us, not only just by us, but certainly we've had a role in that, but work that has been done before us that has proven that the audience can take that, right? So let's talk about Cheer for a second. Cheer begins and ends with Greg Whiteley. Greg Whiteley is the director of that series. He created it. He has co-directors on some of the episodes, but certainly Last Chance U and Cheer and Last Chance U Basketball, which will be releasing soon. Those things are birthed by Greg Whiteley, overseen by Greg Whiteley, and he's as good at what he does as anyone out there. Really, can't say enough about him. And that's part of our company ethos, to be honest. David Gelb and Brian McGinn are the creative engines of Chef's Table, and more people, Danny O'Malley has become very much a part of that creative engine as well. David and Brian are the creative engines of Street Food. Greg Whiteley is the creative engine in spades of Last Chance U and Cheer and all the stuff that he does. So with Last Chance U, I think what Greg proved with Last Chance U is with certain structure that exists naturally in the subject matter that you're documenting, the audience doesn't really need much structure put on top of that. Meaning, a football season is a football season. We sort of know what that looks like. There's training camp, there's a regular season, there's playoffs, there's a championship. Every week there's a game. There's an underdog, there's a favorite. There's somebody you're rooting for, there's somebody you're rooting against. Every game has a halftime. You either come back from halftime or you hold on to a lead at halftime. People get hurt. When, TV executives like to say, like, what's the ticking clock? Well, the ticking clock is actually a clock, and it's right there on the scoreboard, and it's ticking down. So you don't have to ask me what the ticking clock is. What are we building to? What are the stakes? Well, we're building to a championship game at the end of the year. We don't have to do anything to it. It's there. Sport to sort of prove that. When Greg became interested in the college cheerleading world, from, I think, genuinely having spent time making Last Chance U, and then ultimately when he found Navarro College and the folks in Corsicana, Texas, I think it was a similar conversation, right? So now it's not wins and losses, but there still is a season. There still is, I think it's one of the first frames of Cheer. As soon as episode 1 starts, it's telling you, I think it's 58 days to Daytona. Like, right there from frame 1 of Cheer, it is building to the championship in Daytona. And there are benchmarks against a season like that exist naturally. We did a show a couple years ago, or several years ago now, called 7 Days Out, where literally, for me, what was fascinating about 7 Days Out, which is on Netflix, and you can show clips, it's very cool. But what's fascinating to me about that show is, or what was fascinating to me and really interesting to me as we were making that show, is how little can we do to this? If we actually make the initial conceit of the show a clock, a ticking clock, if it's basically in the title, and it's totally blatant in the structure, where you're going to spend 7 days leading up to a big opening, whether it's the opening of 11 Madison Park, or the Chanel fashion show, or a NASA space mission, or a League of Legends esports, or Westminster Dog Show, or Kentucky Derby, like whatever the episode is, if you know when you turn it on that the story is just telling you the build up to this discrete ending, then what else do we really have to do to it? Not much, I hope. We can just sort of find great characters, follow great stories, and tell them in the most authentic way possible. That is what Greg did on Last Chance U, and continues to do on Last Chance U. And that's what Greg did on Cheer. And, Cheer is an interesting case study that has not yet been fully told yet, right? So America and the world found Cheer. Never could have. I mean, I knew that show was good. There was this point where, I had seen the rough cuts, leading up to it. But as these shows ramp up and as you start to see more and more cuts, I would be lying if I said I watched every cut of every show. Like, you sort of watch the first one, maybe the second one, and as the notes are coming in and you see that it's going smoothly, we have 20 some odd projects at a time. I'm not watching every rough cut. But on Cheer, for those who have watched the show, there's particular legal stuff that became very, very important throughout and was not obvious. There were 16 different versions of how we were going to skin that cat from a storytelling standpoint. And Lauren Rady, who is our clearance manager at Boardwalk, she kept saying, have you seen the latest cuts? Have you seen the latest cuts? We really need to lock these cuts. And there's a lot of stuff that I need to talk to you about. And then finally, she just made sure that I cleared like 7 hours on my schedule to watch all 6 episodes of Cheer. And as I was watching these episodes, right before they were locked, I would finish one and I would like walk out of my office and be like, holy shit, this show is so good. Does everybody know how good this show is? And everybody's like, yeah, we all know. And it's like, and then like I'd go back in and watch the other one and come out crying and be like, oh my God, like this show is so good. And so like that was when I became a fan of Cheer. I was also a fan of 7 Days Out. I was also a fan of Fearless. Shows meet audiences and things happen in a way that we can't really control. I was also a fan of Best Shot that we made for YouTube Originals that like, it's awesome. Show clips of Best Shot. It's awesome. Michael John Warren is the director of Best Shot. It's one of the things I'm proudest of, honestly, in my career. And given the times and the conversation that we're having right now about race and about equality and about how different people are treated in our country, go watch Best Shot. It is so well done and so important. if I can say that about a documentary about basketball. But for all of the praise that I would heap on these other shows, Cheer happened in the biggest way. The cheerleaders are on Ellen on Wednesday. They're being parodied on Saturday Night Live on Saturday. Chrissy Teigen is posting pictures of her in a cheerleading outfit. JJ Watt is surprising the cheerleaders on the Today Show. Like, boom. Never been a part of anything like that. But what it's a case study in is that's a documentary.
Right.
That is not a reality show. That is a documentary, and it's one of the only documentaries that I can think of that crossed over with that kind of like zeitgeisty appeal, that didn't have a dead body in it, either at the beginning or the end.
Right.
Like, you know, there are the Jinx crossed over, Ezra Edelman's OJ doc, Making a Murderer, The Keepers. Like, you know, there's plenty of docs that have crossed over, but there's usually a dead body in those.
Definitely.
So Cheer crossed over in this way that I think continues to bring the audience in. Like, oh, you're able to watch, you know, that kind of show. It also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, like, the thing probably that I'm proudest of about that is any producer in town could have found Monica and the Navarro College cheerleading team, right? You put enough casting directors on, you could have found them. They won championships. It would not have taken long. Maybe that's not the right thing to say, but you could have eventually found them. I think 99 out of 100 would have pitched a show probably called Texas Cheer. And it would have been a reality show in front of like interviews in front of a green screen saying like, I'm really nervous to see if I make Matt today, even though I'm doing this interview 6 weeks after I made Matt. You know, I can't believe, you know, I'm like, it just could have very easily been a reality show. Or on the other end of the spectrum, it could have very easily been for a niche audience you could have made a show about two, you know, gay male cheerleaders who are people of color who are cheerleading in Texas. You could have done the Jerry and Ladarius show. And, you know, in many ways, those are two of the characters who really popped for people. But if you had made a show about the LGBTQ community in Texas in the cheerleading world, it probably would have gotten a far narrower audience. But by making a show that is broad appeal about cheerleading and then having those characters emerge, well, now you're having people interact with those characters who otherwise wouldn't. And that, to me, is the thing to be so proud of that show.
That's awesome.
I'll do 2 minutes on the Goop Lab if you want it, which is the Goop Lab to me, and I had worked with Gwyneth over a couple of years trying to figure out what that show could be and how it should be made. The Goop Lab is probably the closest thing that we at Boardwalk have come to doing like a basic cable format. Even when you work with Netflix, there are different people at Netflix. Dom Ladogan, who is a previous E-exec, is our exec at Netflix on the Goop Lab. She's wonderful. And I was abundantly aware as we were shaping that like this in many ways is a show. I mean, it's edgier, racier, and you know, talks about things that you couldn't talk about on basic cable. But from a format standpoint, it's kind of a basic cable format. And that's as close as we had come to doing that for a while. And so I brought in the smartest person that I knew from that world, Shauna Minoprio, who was a showrunner I had worked for years ago, you know, towards the beginning of my career. And she's smart and she's great at her job and she's a lot of fun and she just, you know, makes great stuff. And I learned from her, like to put her at the helm of that and say, okay, here's what I imagine it could be. Here's how I imagine it can look. Here's how I imagine we can present it. But you sort of know this stuff better than I do. And so she, you know, and her team made that show in a way that I'm so proud of. And then I can come in and sort of tweak it. Like when we watched the first cuts of that show, there were sort of basic cable things that were happening. We were looking at this episode where they were eating mushrooms in Jamaica, And every time they went from, the conversation in LA back to Jamaica, they showed the exterior of the house that they were doing the mushrooms in Jamaica. And I was just like, please stop showing the exterior of the house. Like I know they're on the floor tripping their faces off, like hugging each other and crying. I know we're not in Los Angeles anymore. I know that we're in the showing house, and I hope that that's cathartic for our creative partners to be like, oh, I don't have to follow those rules, but I still can work within this framework of what we're doing.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. I know we ran a bit over, and I know you've always got awesome stories. So thank you so much for spending the. No, man. I mean, I feel bad that I took up that much of your morning. So I really appreciate it. I think things that are upcoming where people can find you, sounds like there's Last Chance U basketball, and then I know we didn't even touch on the Lin-Manuel Miranda, the project coming out of Sundance.
I will come back to you and chat about it again. But yes, we are Freestyle Love Supreme, which we do not have a date yet because the world has changed around us a bit. But we are Freestyle Love Supreme, which I directed, which premiered at Sundance, will be launching on Hulu. And more Chef's Table episodes coming out. We have a series called Home Game on Netflix that we're really excited about that comes out this summer. And so lots of stories to be told.
Very good, man. Well, I really appreciate it again. And thanks again for taking the time out of your day.
Thank you so much. Really, really cool to talk to you.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks. Thank you all for listening to another episode of Greenlit, the Buffalo 8 podcast. For financing questions, feel free to contact us at Bondit Media Capital at info@bondit.us. For production, development, and distribution questions, feel free to contact us at Buffalo 8, info@buffalo8.com. We'd love to hear from you and hope you'll continue listening to the podcast episodes ahead.